Today is our week 5 of this semester, and we are going to talk about the biomes and diversity. That's the chapter 5. After studying this chapter, we will be able to answer the following questions: that we have 9 major terrestrial biomes, and what are the environmental conditions that control their distribution, and how does the vertical stratification differentiate life zones in oceans. We will also talk about the coral reefs, mangroves, estuaries, and wetlands that are biologically very important and why they are very important. We'll talk about the biodiversity and also list several regions of high biodiversity. We'll also talk about the benefits of biodiversity in that portion and the major human-caused threats to the biodiversity and how we can reduce these threats to biodiversity. So let's start with the case scenario of these boreal forests. So how forests responses to global warming? How will the biological communities, they respond to climate change? So this is one of the great unknowns in environmental science today, that how our biological communities, they respond to the climate change, to global warming. Will the northern regions that now support those boreal forests, that are the northern forests, for example, that shift to another biome, for example, the hardwood forest, open savannas, grasslands, or something entirely different? Because one of the main challenges right now is the boreal forests. Will they shift to another biome? So that's a question. One approach is to use the field tests. There is some field tests that's going on in which the mixtures of plants, they are grown in natural settings. Those settings include the competition for resources, predator or prey interactions, natural climatic variations, and other ecological factors. Professor Peter Rich and his colleagues and student research assistants, they are carrying out such field study or field experiments in a patch of boreal forests in Minnesota. These boreal forests that are located in the northern part, they are the Professor Peter Rich and his colleagues and student research assistants, like here you can see in this figure. They are carrying out the experiment, a field study, in one of the patches of boreal forest in Minnesota. They call this experiment as B4 warmed. Why they call it at B4 warmed is that which stands for, B stands for boreal forests warming at ecotone in danger. They are artificially actually raising those ambient temperatures in a series of boreal forest plots to emulate the warming climatic conditions. So whatever they are doing right now, they are everything they are doing in a closed, uh, it's not an open experiment, it's a closed experiment, we call it. That means all the environmental conditions, they are increasing the ambient temperatures. They are artificially raising ambient temperatures in a series of these boreal forest plots in order to create those warming climatic conditions. It's too early to know exactly what the long-term effects of warming will be on the northern forest community. It seems likely that species such as aspen, spruce, and birch, they are now at the southern edge of their range in the study area. So what they actually want to see is that in this study area, they won't do as well under a warmer climate as the temperate maple oak forests now growing farther south. This study actually attempts to understand how climate changes may affect a broad biological community, or we can say a biome, and the species that make it up. The careful, systematic approach demonstrated here is a hallmark of science and a way to reveal those connections. This before warmed experiment that was carried out by Professor Peter Rich and his colleagues and a student research assistance. Main aim of this research was to understand how the climatic change is going to affect a broad biological community, or we can say the biome, and also the species that make it up. Here you can see that this is the layout of that before worm study. You can see here, these are the different plots. This is the open one, and this is the forest, and these are control. So they have created these ambient temperatures. So you can see the ambient control with the blue circles here. That means plus, and then we have the soil cable control. These are the soil cable controls. And then this orange color here, it denotes the plus 2 degrees centigrade, or and red color, it denotes the 4 degrees centigrade. So this is how they control that experiment, and how they provided these ambient temperatures. So blue ones are the ambient controls actually, and the red ones, in that they have increased plus 4 degrees centigrade, and the orange ones are the plus 2 degrees centigrade. So here you can see that these are the lamps, different 1000-watt lamps here, that are 1.5 meter apart. These are 20 centimeter space soil heating cables. That's heating. These are the different cables that is heating the soil. So this was all a closed kind of experiment in order to see that how that patch of boreal forest, the species that grow there, they are actually how they respond to the increasing temperatures under controlled conditions. Talking about the terrestrial biomes, we call large biological communities as biomes. That's the definition of biome. As we studied the before worm study, it shows that increasing temperatures and the drier climate expected if we continue our current path toward global climate change, they are likely to bring those dramatic transformations to the boreal forest along the Canadian border from Minnesota to Maine. To evaluate the potential effects of those environmental changes, it is very useful to understand the pattern of plant and animal distribution that occur in various environmental conditions. Like we already discussed, that these large communities, biological communities, we call as biomes. If we know the range of temperature and precipitation in a particular place, we can generally predict what kind of biome is likely to occur there in the absence of human disturbance. An important characteristic of each biome is a biodiversity, or we can say the number and variety of different biological species that live there. So biome actually means the larger biological communities, and biodiversity is the number and variety of different biological species that live there. Biomes most likely occur in the absence of human disturbance or other disruptions according to the average annual temperature and precipitation. Here in this diagram, you can see that it doesn't consider any kind of soil types. So here you can see that the x-axis here, it denotes the this average temperature in centigrade, and y-axis denotes the annual precipitation in centimeters. So there is not any kind of that what kind of soil there will be. So it all depends upon the average annual temperature and precipitation that different biomes they occur. So here you can see these different kinds of biomes: the tundra, boreal forest, temperate forests, temperate rainforests, tropical seasonal forests, and these are here the deserts where the annual precipitation is very low. In the tropical rainforest, the annual precipitation goes more than 400. That's the wetter climate here. And here you can see in deserts, the climate is very dry. That means the precipitation is very low. But you can see that there is not in this diagram, you will not be able to see any kind of soil type, topography, or wind speed, or other important environmental factors. So that means these biomes that occur, they can be predicted based on the temperature and precipitation found in an area. Like we already discussed, like this in this figure, you can see that savannas, they are somewhat dry, so their precipitation is almost between 0 to 100 centimeters, and temperature also is very high. So deserts, here you can see the temperature is very high and precipitation is very low. So one thing I want to mention here is that when we classify any biomes, we don't consider any kind of soil type, topography, or wind speed, or other important environmental factors. What we consider is just the the average temperature and the annual precipitation. So these are the different kind of biomes, and we will be talking about all these biomes in our coming up slides. Biomes also, they vary with the latitude. Some biomes are named for their latitudes as tropical rainforests. They occur between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. We have Arctic tundra that lies near or above the Arctic Circle. So many temperature controlled biomes, they occur in the latitudinal bands. A band of boreal forest crosses Canada and Siberia. Some tropical forests, they occur near the equator. There are expansive grasslands that lie near or just beyond the tropics. We have many biomes that are even named for their latitudes, like tropical rainforests. So these occur between the Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn. So depending upon their latitudes, they are named accordingly. Or we have some Arctic tundra that lies near or above the Arctic Circle. That's why it's called the Arctic tundra. So these biomes, they are named after their latitudes, according to their latitudes. We have some vertical zonation. That means the temperature and precipitation, they change with the elevation as well as with latitude. In mountainous regions, the temperatures are very cool and precipitation is usually greater at high elevations. So mountains are cooler and often wetter than low elevations. Vertical zonation is actually the term that's applied to the vegetation zones, which are defined by their altitude. 100-kilometer transit from California Central Valley up to Mount Whitney, for example, it crosses many vegetation zones that you find on a journey when you uh, travel from Southern California to Northern Canada. So those different kinds of zones, they are defined by their altitudes, and it's called as vertical zonation. Like here you can see that in this figure, while we travel from the Southern California to Mount Whitney, you can see that there are different kinds of these uh, forests. You can see the different kinds of vegetation that grows here. For example, uh, at this elevation, you can see when we travel from Southern California to Mount Whitney, it crosses many vegetation zones. So here you can see there might be some shrub deserts, and then as we go higher, there are the grasslands, that's the temperate grasslands. As we move further, we will find some oak woodlands. Moving further, we will find some spruce or fir or alpine. So this is the elevation that as we go higher and higher, there will be more kinds of these vegetations. So temperature and precipitation, they change actually with elevation as well as with the latitude. In mountainous regions, the temperatures, we know they are cooler, and precipitation is also usually greater at higher elevation. So mountains, that's why we say that the mountains are very cool and often wetter than the low elevations here. So that means as we go ahead, uh, as the elevation increases, so you will see the vegetation also, you will see a different kind of vegetation like the alpine, the spruce or pine or oak forests. This we call as vertical zonation. Tropical rainforest, talking about the tropical rainforest, the humid tropical regions, they support one of the most complex and biologically rich biome types in the world, like you can see here. Although there are very different kinds of moist tropical forests, all have very uh, small rainfall and, or we can say, ample amount of rainfall and uniform temperatures. There are certain cool cloud forests that are found in high mountains where there is a lot of fog and mist that keep that vegetation wet. Tropical rainforests, they occur where rainfall is abundant, that's more than 200 centimeters or 80 inches per year, and temperatures are warm to hot year round. So these shaded months you can see here, they are actually above freezing, and these are the monthly temperatures here. The temperature is in degree centigrade, so, and the precipitation in millimeters. So you can see the temperature is mostly in these areas, is between, is almost 30 degrees centigrade. So you can see that uh, the nutrient cycles of these forests, they are also very distinctive. The soil of these tropical moist forest types tends to be thin, it's acidic and nutrient poor, but yet it has a very large number of species that can be mind boggling. About 90% of all the nutrients in the rainforest, they are contained in the bodies of these living organisms. Talking about the tropical seasonal forests, they have annual dry seasons. Many of the trees and shrubs that you see in the seasonal forest, they are drought deciduous. What do we mean by drought deciduous is that they lose their leaves and also stop growing when there is no water available. These seasonal forests, they are often open woodlands that grade into the savannas. Soils of dry forest, they often have higher nutrient levels and are more agriculturally productive than those of a rainforest. Finally, they have fewer insects, parasites, and fungal diseases than a wet forest, makes a dry or seasonal forest a healthier place for humans to live. Consequently, these forests are highly endangered in many species. The areas that support tropical rainforests, they include the drought-tolerant forests that look brown and dormant in the dry season, but they burst into vivid green during the rainy months. These forests are often called dry tropical forests because they are dry almost all of the year. And one point here that you have to keep in mind, that soils of these dry forests, they have higher nutrient levels and are agriculturally more important than those of the rainforest. Talking about the tropical savannas or the grasslands, that's one more biome. That's another kind of biome. Like tropical seasonal forests, most tropical savannas and grasslands, they have a rainy season, but generally the rains are less abundant or less dependable than in a forest. During dry seasons, there can be some fires that can sweep across a grassland, so that can kill off certain young trees and keep the landscape open. Savanna and grassland plants have adaptations. That means they can survive drought, heat, and fires. Many of those plants, they have deep, long-lived roots. What's the function of those long-lived deep roots is that they seek groundwater and that persist when leaves and stems above the ground, they die back. So after a fire, or if there is a drought or fire, the fresh green shoots, they grow quickly from the roots. There are some migratory grazers, such as, like here you can see in this picture, such as the wild beast, antelope, or bison that thrive on this new growth. Grazing pressure from domestic livestock is an important grassland and savannas. So these are very good for those savannas. Talking about the deserts, or they are hot or cold but always dry. So this is also one of the biomes. that we will be talking about. So when we think of deserts, we think as we think of them as barren and biologically impoverished. Their vegetation is very less, that means very sparse, but it can be surprisingly diverse. And most desert plants and animals, they are highly adapted to survive long droughts, or we can say extreme heat, or often extreme cold. Deserts, they occur where the precipitation is low. When we say low, we say less than 30 centimeter of rain per year. That means if there is less than 30 centimeter of rain per year. Adaptation to these conditions, they include the water storing leaves and stems, like you have seen in deserts. We have those cactus plants that have those needle shaped leaves. So what's the function of those needle shaped leaves is that their area, the leaf area is very less. That means there will be less precipitation. So less precipitation, less evaporation, that helps those plants like cactus to store that water. So if there will be the broader leaf area, there will be more precipitation or evaporation, and they will need more water. So they have those plants have those adaptations. They also, you can see that they have some thick epidermal layers to reduce that water loss. So these are some of the these adaptations that those desert plants they have. They adapt in order to thrive in those deserts. Also, they have one more feature, that's the salt tolerance. As in other dry environments, many plants, they are drought deciduous. Most desert plants, they also bloom and set seeds quickly when rain does fall. Like plants, animals in deserts, they are also, they have special adaptations. Many are nocturnal. They spend their days in the burrows to avoid those sun's heat and desiccation. We have some pocket mice, kangaroo rats, and gerbilus, and can get some more of their moisture from seeds and plants. We have some kind of desert rodents that live there. They also have highly concentrated urine and nearly dry feces. So what's the function of that? Because they have those highly concentrated urine and dry feces, it allows them to eliminate body waste without losing the precious moisture. Here in this picture, you can see that these are the months of the year, and you can see that mostly all of the months of the year, they are dry in the deserts. Talking about another kind of biome, that's the temperate grasslands. These are used to have rich soils. So what makes those temperate grassland soils, this kind of biome, a very rich soil? Why they have rich soils? Usually grasslands, they are complex, diverse mixture of grasses, the flowering herbaceous plants. We call them as forbs. We have some myriad flowering forbs that make grassland colorful and lovely in summer. In dry grasslands, the vegetation may be less than a meter tall. Like here you can see in this picture, the grasslands, they don't have tall trees. The vegetation that they have, that may be less than a meter tall. So in more humid areas, grasses can exceed 2 meters. Whereas the scattered trees occur in a grassland, we call it as a savanna. We have to keep one thing here in, you have to keep one thing in mind, that if you see scattered trees that occur in the grasslands, we don't call that a grassland, that's called a savanna. Deep roots that help the plants in temperate grasslands and savannas, they survive the drought, fire, and extreme heat and cold. So that's a particular function, or we can say the adaptation of those plants, that they have very deep roots that help them to survive that drought, fire, or extreme heat and cold temperatures. These deep roots, they together with an annual winter accumulation of dead leaves on the surface, they produce a thick, organic, rich soils in temperate grasslands. So that's why the temperate grasslands, they have richer soils, because of these deep roots together with the annual winter accumulation. When the dead leaves they accumulate on the surface, and you all know that when there is some litter that has been collected on the surface, some microorganisms they just try to decompose that litter, and then that's how they make that soil rich or organic rich soil in temperate grasslands. So because of this rich soil, many grasslands they have been converted to farmland. Talking about the temperate scrublands, such conditions they are often described as Mediterranean. When we talk about the Mediterranean, this means that the regions where the hot season coincides with the dry season, producing those hot, dry summers or cool, moist winters. The evergreen shrubs with small, leathery, or we can say sclerophyllous or hard, waxy leaves form the dense thickets. We have some scrub oaks, drought resistant pines, or other small trees that you will see often clustered in sheltered valleys. Periodic fires they burn fiercely in this fuel rich plant assemblage and are a major factor in plant succession. In California, this landscape is often called as chaparral. Spanish word for that is the thicket. So resident animals, they are drought tolerant species such as we can see the jackrabbits, kangaroo rats, mule deer, chipmunks, lizards you can see there, and many bird species. Very similar landscapes are often found along the Mediterranean coast as well as the southern Australia, the central Kyle, and South Africa. Talking about the another biome, that's the temperate forest, they can be evergreen or deciduous. So when we talk about the deciduous, that means they lose leaves seasonally, or when they are evergreen coniferous, that means they are the cone bearing. You might have seen those alpine trees, the fir, spruce, they bear the crones. So those are the evergreen or deciduous plants. So these forests are grouped together by these kind of tree types. That means the broadleaf deciduous plants and the evergreen coniferous plants. These forests they occupy a wide range of precipitation conditions, but they occur mainly between 30 and 55 latitudes. In general, we can group these forests by the tree type that we already discussed. That means they can be grouped according to the tree type they have. For example, if they have the broad-leaved deciduous plants, or if they have any kind of evergreen coniferous plants, that means the cone-bearing plants. Talking about the deciduous forests, in mid altitudes, these forests they are deciduous and they lose their leaves in winter. The loss of this green chlorophyll pigment can produce brilliant colors in these forests in autumn. That's the golden yellow. At lower altitudes, the broadleaf forests they may be evergreen or drought deciduous. There are some southern live oaks, for example, they are broadleaf evergreen trees. These forests they shelter a great variety of songbirds. Northern American deciduous forests they once were covered most of what is now the eastern half of United States, we can say, or the southern Canada. Most of the Western Europe was once the deciduous forest, but it was cleared 1,000 years ago. It has been found that when European settlers they first came to North America, they quickly settled and cut most of those eastern deciduous forests for the purpose of firewood, the lumber, or industrial uses, as well as to clear those farmlands. Many of these regions now have not returned to deciduous forests, though the dominant species may have changed, but they are trying to rejuvenate those deciduous forests. Talking about the coniferous forest, that means the forest that have those cone-bearing plants. The coniferous forests, they provide most wood products in North America. There has been some dominant wood production regions that include the southern Atlantic and Gulf Coast states, also the Mountain West and the Pacific Northwest. That means the Northern California to Alaska, you can see. But coniferous forests, they support forestry in many regions. Often these kind of forests, they occur where these kind of plants, they occur where the moisture is limited. In cold climates, moisture is unavailable. That means when there is frozen in winter. For example, in hot climates, they may have some seasonal drought, sandy soils, or hold a little moisture, and they are often occupied by those conifers. They also have some thin, waxy leaves, like we already discussed, the needles. They help these trees to reduce the moisture loss, because we all know that the more the leaf, the broader the leaf area is, the broader the leaf is, there will be more moisture loss. That means more evaporation. Talking about the tropical savannas, like we already discussed, these savannas, they are actually kind of grasslands, but they don't have those plants like grasslands, like we already discussed, the smaller plants, smaller vegetation. So they have a kind of trees. So tropical savannas and grasslands, they experience annual drought and rainy seasons, year-round warm temperatures. You may find some thorny acacias or abundant grazers. They thrive in this savanna. So here you can see that the x-axis, you can see these are the months and this is the temperature. So January, February, March, April. So they are the moisture deficit, and these months, they don't, these are not moisture deficit, and this is also moisture deficit, the December. Talking about the deserts, that's also one kind of biome. They generally receive less than 300 millimeter, or we can say when there is less than 30 centimeter of precipitation per year. Hot deserts, as in the American Southwest, endure year-round drought and extreme heat in summer. So you can see that they almost have all the time very high temperatures, the deserts, almost every month. Grasslands, they occur at the mid-latitudes on all continents. They are kept open by extreme temperatures, dry conditions, and periodic fires. Grasslands can have high plant and animal diversity also. Temperate forests, they can be evergreen or deciduous, like we already discussed. Broadleaf forests, they occur throughout the world where the rainfall is plentiful. And in mid-latitudes, these forests, they are deciduous and lose their leaves in winter. Talking about the temperate rainforests, which is another kind of biome, the coniferous forests of Pacific coast, they grow in extremely wet conditions. The wettest coastal forests, they are known as the temperate forests. A cool, rainy forest, often enshrouded in fog, condensation in the canopy, like the leaf drip, is a major form of precipitation. Mild year-round temperatures and abundant rainfall up to 250 centimeters per year results in green plants, or we can say the giant plants, the luxuriant, those plant growth. You can see those in California redwoods, the largest trees in the world and the largest above ground organisms ever known to have existed in those California redwoods. These redwoods, they often once grew along the Pacific coast from California to Oregon, but logging has reduced their range to a few small fragments of these areas. We already discussed about the boreal forests. They lie north of the temperate zone. Because the conifers can survive the winter cold, they tend to dominate those boreal forests or northern forests. So you can see most of the conifer trees, that means the cone bearing trees, you will find in those boreal forests that lie north of the temperate zone, or we can say those northern forests. They lie between 50° and 60° north. Mountainous areas at lower latitudes may also have some characteristic and species of those boreal forests. Dominant trees you can find in these boreal forests as pines, hemlocks, spruce, cedar, and fir. They are all the cone-bearing plants. Some deciduous trees you can also find there. For example, we have some maples, birch, aspen, or alder. These are the deciduous. So this boreal forest is actually a mixture of both those coniferous and deciduous trees or plants. These forests, the boreal forest, they are slow growing because of the cold temperatures and short frost-free growing season, but they are still an expensive resource. In Siberia, Canada, and Western United States, they're all large regional economies that depend on these boreal forests. There are a number of activities, or you can say they are the favorite places for hunting, fishing, recreation, as well as extractive resource use. So if those forests disappear as a result of global warming that we already discussed when we started the chapter, both human uses and the unique species that it has, like the moose, the lynx, otters that depend on that biome, they will be missed. The extreme rich edge of those boreal forests where forest gradually gives way to open tundra is known by its Russian name called as taiga. Tundras, these are the kind of biomes where the temperatures are below freezing most of the year. Only small hardy vegetation can survive. Tundra, a treeless landscape, we can say that occurs at high latitudes or on mountain tops. It has a growing season of only 2 to 3 months, and it may have frost any month of the year. Some people consider this tundra a variant of grasslands because it has no trees. Others consider it a very cold desert because the water is unavailable most of the year. Compared to other biomes, these tundras, they have relatively low diversity. You can see some dwarf shrubs such as willows, sedges, grasses, mosses, and lichens that tend to dominate the vegetation. Some other biodiversity that you may find at tundra is the migratory musk or alpine mountain sheep or mountain goats that live on the vegetation because they move frequently to new pastures. So that was all about the biomes. We talked about all 9 types of biomes. So let's move to the marine ecosystem. The biological communities in oceans and seas, they are poorly understood, but they are probably diverse and complex as we talked about the terrestrial biomes. So in this section, we will explore a few facets of these fascinating environments. Oceans, they cover nearly three-fourths of the Earth's surface and contribute in important, although often unrecognized ways to terrestrial ecosystem. The ocean currents, they also contribute to the distribution of biological productivity as they support or transport the nutrients and phytoplankton far from the shore. When we talk about the phytoplankton, these are actually the tiny free-floating photosynthetic algae that often support a marine food web rather than trees or grasses. In oceans, this photosynthetic activity they tends to be greatest near the coastlines where there is nitrogen, phosphorus, and other nutrients. They wash offshore and fertilize those primary producers. Let's talk in detail about this marine ecosystem. Open ocean communities, they vary from surface to the hadal zone. Ocean systems can be described by depth and proximity to shore. So we have some benthic communities that occur at the bottom, and we have some pelagic zones that are the water column. The epipelagic zone has photosynthetic organisms. Below that are the mesopelagic or bathypelagic zones. The deepest layers are abyssal zone, that's about 4,000 meter, and then we have the hadal zone. You can see here in this figure. So these are the vertical stratification that gives a key feature of aquatic ecosystem. We have some hadal zone, abyssal zone about 6,000 meters below, and then at 4,000 we have that bathypelagic zone, and then 1,000 meter we have the mesopelagic zone and the epipelagic zone. These are called the pelagic zones. Light penetrates only the top, that means 10 to 20 meter of ocean. Below this level, temperature drops and pressure increases. Nearshore environments, they include those intertidal zones. So these are the nearshore environments. And we have some estuaries also. This figure here so gives us the vertical stratification of aquatic ecosystem. We have some deep sea thermal vent communities. When we talk about the deep sea thermal communities, they are a remarkable type of marine ecosystem. These were completely unknown until 1977 when the deep sea submarine Alvin descended to the deep ocean floor. These communities, the deep sea thermal communities, they are based on microbes that capture chemical energy mainly from sulfur compounds that are released from thermal vents, jets of hot water or minerals on the ocean floor. Magma that's present below the ocean crust, it heats these vents. Tube worms, mussels, and microbes on the vents are adapted to survive both extreme temperatures, that means above 350 degrees centigrade, and intense water pressure at the depths of like 7,000 meters. Oceanographs, they have Oceanographers, they have discovered thousands of different types of organisms. Most of them are microscopic in these communities. Some estimate that the total mass of microbes on the seafloor, it represents about 1/3 of all biomass on the planet. So in short, we can say that these deep sea thermal vent communities that are present in the marine system, they are based on the microbes that capture that sulfur compounds that are released from those thermal vents on the ocean floor. Coral reefs, talking about those, they are among the best known marine systems because of their extraordinary biological community and their diverse and beautiful organisms. Reefs, actually, what are reefs? Are the colonies of minute colonial animals. We call those as coral polyps that live symbiotically with photosynthetic algae. These calcium-rich coral skeletons, they shelter the algae, and algae nourish the coral animals. That means both the algae and the coral reefs, they are benefited. That's why they live in symbiotic relation. The complex structure of reef also shelters countless species of fish, worms, crustaceans, and other life forms. The coral reefs, they occur where the water is shallow and clear enough for sunlight to reach the photosynthetic algae. They cannot tolerate abundant nutrients in the water as nutrients support tiny floating plants and animals called planktons, which block that sunlight. It has been found that these coral reefs, they are among the most endangered biological communities in marine ecosystem. We have found a large amount of sediment from coastal development, forming sewage or other pollution that can reduce the water clarity or smother that coral. Destructive fishing practices, for example, some fishing practices the people adopt right now is include the dynamites or cyanide poison that have destroyed those many Asian reefs. Reefs can also be damaged or killed by changes in temperature, for example, some invasive fish or by some diseases. Coral bleaching is one of is the other thing that's affecting those, that's killing those reefs. So what the coral bleaching is actually the whitening of reefs due to stress, which is often followed by the coral death. It's a growing and spreading problem that worries marine biologists. Talking about the tidal shores, the mangroves, they are a diverse group of salt tolerant trees that grow along the warm, calm marine coasts around the world. So these mangroves, they grow in shallow tidal mud flats, or mangroves, they help to stabilize the shorelines, they blunt the force of storms, or they build the land by trapping those sediments and organic material. It has been found that after this devastating Indonesian tsunami of 2004 studies, it showed that mangroves, when where they still stood, helped reduce the speed, height, and turbulence of tsunami waves. Detritus, including falling leaves, collects below the mangroves, and those leaves, they provide nutrients for a diverse community of animals and plants. Both marine species like crabs and fish and terrestrial species such as birds and bats, they rely on those mangroves for shelter and food. In short, we can say that these mangroves, if removed, they will affect the diversity a lot, because these mangroves, they are very this have helped in 2004 tsunami. They have helped to reduce that speed, height, and turbulence of tsunami waves. So that means when we remove those mangrove forests, we are actually trying, we are going towards the devastation. That means if anyhow there will be any storm or tsunami or any kind of uh, effects, and there are no mangrove forests, so there will be a lot of loss. And it's also, it gives shelter to many crabs and fish also. We have some estuaries that are the bays where the rivers empty into the sea, mixing fresh water with salt water. Salt marshes, shallow wetland flooded regularly or occasionally with seawater, they occur on those shallow coastlines, including the estuaries. These estuaries, they are usually very calm, warm, and nutrient rich. Estuaries and salt marshes are biologically diverse and productive. What the rivers do is that they provide nutrients and sediments, and a muddy bottom supports the emergent plants. That means whose leaves emerge above the water surface, as well as the young forms of crustaceans, for example, the crabs, the shrimp, mollusks. We have such as clams or oysters. Nearly two-thirds of all marine fish and shellfish, they rely on those estuaries and saline wetlands for spawning or juvenile development. Tide pools are actually the depressions in a rocky shoreline that are flooded at high tide, but they retain some water at low tide. These areas remain rocky, whereas the wave action, it prevents most plant growth or sediment accumulation. Extreme conditions with frigid flooding at high tide and hot, desiccating sunshine at low tide makes life impossible for most of the species. But the specialized animal and plants that do occur on this rocky intertidal zone are astonishingly very diverse and beautiful, like here you can see in this picture. Talking about the freshwater ecosystem, the freshwater environments are less extensive than the marine environments, but they are the centers of biodiversity. In deserts, isolated pools, streams, and even underground water systems support that astonishing biodiversity as well as provide water to land animals. Freshwater ecosystem, let's talk about the lakes. The freshwater lakes, like marine environments, have distinct vertical zones. Near the surface, you will see a subcommunity of plankton, mainly microscopic plants or animals or single-celled animals like amoebae or we can see protists. They float freely in the water column. Insects such as the water striders or mosquitoes, they also live at the air-water interface. You can see some fish that move through the water column, sometimes near the surface and sometimes at the depth. And finally, the bottom or benthos, which is occupied by a variety of snails, burrowing worms, fish, and other organisms. These burrowing worms, snails, or other organisms, they make up the benthic community. It has been found that oxygen levels are lowest in the benthic environment mainly because there is little mixing to introduce oxygen to this zone. That means the condition is anaerobic condition. That means they are not using oxygen. So bacteria may live in low oxygen sediments. In the littoral zone, emergent plants such as caryls or rush, they grow in the bottom sediment. These plants, they create important functions like functional links between the layers of the ecosystem, and they may also provide greatest primary productivity of the system also. These are the layers of a deep lake. The layers of a deep lake are determined mainly by the gradient of light, oxygen, and temperature. You can see here the epimelon is affected by surface mixing from wind and thermal convections, while mixing between the hypolimnion and epilimnion is inhibited by a sharp temperature and density difference at this thermocline region. Freshwater lakes, like marine environments, they have distinct vertical zones. Near the surface, a subcommunity of plankton will be found, mainly microscopic plants, animals, and protists, which float freely in the water column. Also, there are some insects such as water striders and mosquitoes that live in this air-water interface. Here at the benthos layer, you can see that there is a benthos community. You will see a large population of snails, the burrowing worms, fish, and other organisms that make this benthic community. That was all about the freshwater lakes. Moving to the wetlands. Wetlands are actually the shallow ecosystem in which the land surface is saturated or submerged at least part of the year. Wetlands have vegetation that's adapted to grow under saturated conditions. These legal definitions are very important because although the wetlands make up only a small part of some countries, they are important in conservation debates and are the focus of continual legal disputes in North America and elsewhere around the world. Although wetlands they occupy less than 5% of the land in the United States, the Fish and Wildlife Service estimates that one-third of all endangered species they spend at least part of their lives in the wetlands. Wetlands also retain the stormwater and reduce flooding by slowing the rate at which the rainfall reaches the river systems. The floodwater storage is worth $3 billion to $4 billion per year in the United States. So you can see that how important these wetlands are. As water stands in the wetlands, it also seeps into the ground, replenishing the groundwater table or groundwater supplies of water. Wetlands filter and even purify the urban and farm runoff. They have certain kind of bacteria and plants that take up nutrients and contaminants in water. They are also in great demand for filling and development. You can see those often near the cities or farms where the land is valuable, and once drained, the wetlands are easily converted to more uh, luxury uses. At least half of all the wetlands that exist in the United States when Europeans first arrived here have been drained or filled or degraded. In most major farming states, losses have been more worse. Talking about the insects and invertebrates that make up half of all known species, many species of insects and invertebrates like this blue morpho butterfly are beautiful as well as ecologically important. Biodiversity hotspots are rich and threatened. The Malaysian Peninsula for flowering plants, while Britain with an area twice as large as 1400 species, there may be more botanists in Britain than there are species of higher plants. South America, on the other hand, we have seen that there are fewer than 100 botanists to study 200,000 species of plants. Of all the world's species, only 10 to 15% they live in North America and Europe, and many of the organisms in mega diversity countries have never been studied by any scientist. We benefit from other organisms in many ways, some of which we don't appreciate until a particular species or community disappears. Even seemingly obscure and insignificant organisms, they play important roles in ecological systems, or they can be the source of genes or drugs that someday may be very indispensable. Biodiversity, they provide us food and medicines. Genetic material from wild plants has been used to improve the domestic crops. It has been found that noted tropical ecologist, that's the Norman Mears, he estimates that as many as 80,000 edible wild plant species could be utilized by humans. Villagers in Indonesia, for example, they are thought to use some 4,000 native plant and animal species for food, medicine, and other products. It has been found that few of these species have been explored for possible domestication or more widespread cultivation. Talking about the benefits of biodiversity, it can also aid the ecosystem stability. Biodiversity may help biological communities withstand the environmental stress the better and recover more quickly than those with fewer species. A reason for that may be that in a diverse community, some species they survive the disturbance and so ecological functions are maintained because we don't fully understand the complex interrelationships among the organisms. We are often surprised and dismayed at the effects of removing those significant members of biological communities. For example, it's estimated that 95% of potential pest and disease carrying organisms in the world are controlled by natural predators and competitors. So, when we are killing those predators or competitors, we are losing that biodiversity that can help us in controlling pest and other ecological functions. Or in short, we can say that maintaining biodiversity is essential to preserve the ecological services. So what's the main threat to this biodiversity is the habitat destruction. Surface mining, for example, it strips of the land covering along with everything that's growing on it. Waste from mining operations that can bury the valleys or poison the streams with toxic materials affecting that biodiversity. Dam building floods vital stream habitats under deep reservoirs, and eliminates the food resources and breeding habitat for some of the aquatic species. So, by these processes or methods, we are actually destructing their habitat. Our current fishing methods, they are highly unsustainable. One of the most destructive fishing technique, that's the bottom trawling, in which the heavy nets are dragged across the ocean floor, scooping up every living thing and crushing the bottom structure to lifeless rubble. So this technique of fishing, that's called the bottom trawling, is actually damaging their habitat. Marine biologist Jan Lebashino says that trawling is like collecting forest mushrooms with a bulldozer. So you can imagine that how destructive it is for the fish community or other biodiversity that lives in that ocean. Here in these pictures, you can see that how the wooded area of Cadiz Township in southern Wisconsin during European settlement, it decreases. So green areas represent the amount of land in forest each year. So in 1831, you can see everything was green. In 1882, it has decreased. So this decrease in wooded area of Cadiz Township in southern Wisconsin during the European settlement has led to the historical decrease in forested area in southern Wisconsin. In 1902, it's even much lower, and in 1950, you can see some of those forests. So that's a historical decrease in forest area in southern Wisconsin. Fragmentation, it reduces the habitat to small isolated areas. In addition to the loss of total habitat area, the loss of large contiguous areas, which is a serious problem, there is a general term for this, that's the habitat fragmentation. That means the reduction of habitat into small isolated patches. A very small population may not have enough breeding adults to be viable even under normal circumstances. An important question in conservation biology is what is the minimal viable population size for a species, and when these dwindling populations have grown too small to survive. It can also divide the populations into isolated groups, making them more vulnerable to the catastrophes. And this kind of fragmentation, it actually reduces the biodiversity because many species, for example, the bears and large cats, they require large territories to subsist. Invasive species, it's also a growing threat to the biodiversity. Some species, they are deliberately released because people believe that they will be aesthetically pleasing or economically beneficial. Some of the worst are pets released to the wild when owners they get tired of them. Many hitch a ride in ship blast water in the wood of packing crates inside the suitcases or shipping containers or in the soil of potted plants. Sometimes we introduce those invasive species into new habitats, thinking that we are being kind and compassionate without being aware of the ecological consequences. So these invasive species, they are actually organisms that thrive in new territories, but where they are free of predators, disease, or resource limitations. Here in this figure, you can see that invasive leafy spurge, that's the Euphorbia ascula blanket, a formerly diverse pasture. It introduced accidentally and inedible for most of the herbivores. This plant costs hundreds of millions of dollars each year in lost grazing value and in weed control. Pollution also poses many types of risks. Lead poisoning is another major cause of mortality for many species of wildlife. There has been some bottom feeding waterfalls such as ducks, swans, and cranes that ingest the spent shotgun pellets that fall into the lakes and marshes. They store these pellets in instead of stones in their gizzards, and the lead slowly accumulates in their blood and other tissues. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services estimates that 3,000 metric tons of lead shards are deposited annually in wetlands, and that between 2 and 3 million waterfowl die each year from lead poisoning. The links between the pesticides and declines of fish-eating birds were documented in 1970s. Uh, Population declines are usually likely in species that are high in food chains such as marine mammals, alligators, fish. Accumulation of DDT, PCBs, dioxins, and lead in the food chain, they are a major cause of mortality. Pollution may also pose many kinds of risks also, like we already talked about the lead shot that's shown in the stomach of a bald eagle consumed along with its prey. Some fishing weights and shots, they remain a major cause of lead poisoning in aquatic and fish-eating birds. So when these kind of fish, they store those pellets in their gizzard, and uh, this and any bird, for example bald eagle, it consumes that prey, so it's actually eating those pellets that help that leads to the lead poisoning. Here in this x-ray you can see, so this is the actually those pellets in the stomach of a bald eagle that has eaten those fish. Overharvesting is one of the major challenges that depletes or eliminates the species. It involves taking more individuals than reproduction can replace. A classic example is the extermination of American passenger pigeon and the near extermination of American bison. Fish stocks have been seriously depleted by overharvesting in many parts of the world, and it has been found that at least three-quarters of all commercial oceanic fishes, they are actually overharvested. Overharvesting, it eliminates all the species that involves taking more individuals than reproduction can replace. It has been found that a pair of stuffed passenger pigeons, the last member of this species, died in Cincinnati Zoo in 1914. Here you can see a diver that's using the cyanide to stun the fish for international aquarium trade. And he doesn't even know that half this cyanide poisoning is actually killing the coral reefs in that ocean. Predator and pest control is expensive but widely practiced. This animal control effort costs about $20 million in federal and state funds each year. It has been found that defenders of wildlife regard this program as cruel and mostly ineffective in reducing those livestock losses. Hunting and fishing laws have been abolished to protect the useful species. In 1874, a bill was introduced in US Congress to protect the American bison, whose numbers are falling dramatically. The wildlife regulations and refuges established since that time have been very successful for many species. The Endangered Species Act protects the habitat and species. ESA means the Endangered Species Act. It provides the criteria for identifying the species that's at risk. Number two, it does the directions for planning for their recovery. And number three, it helps in assistance to landowners to help them find ways to meet both economic needs and the needs of those rare species. And finally, the enforcement of measures for protecting those endangered species and their habitat. And that act is called as Endangered Species Act. Worldwide, the International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, they list 17,741 endangered and threatened species. But IUCN has no direct jurisdiction for slowing the loss of those species. Within the United States, the Endangered Species Act provides the mechanisms for reducing the species loss. There are certain recovery plans that aim to rebuild this population. The Fish and Wildlife Services, that's the FWS, can help landowners prepare the habitat conservation plans. These plans are specific management approaches that identify steps to conserve that particular species of critical habitat. For example, the red cockaded woodpecker, which is an endangered species that preys on insects, is damaged in damaged pine forests from North Carolina to Texas. Few suitable forests remain on public land, so much of the remaining population that occurs on privately owned lands that are actively managed for timber production. Habitat production may be better than the species production. By concentrating on individual species, we spend millions of dollars to breed the animals or plants in captivity that have no natural habitat where they can be released. While the flagship species such as mountain gorillas or Indian tigers, they are reproducing well in zoos and wild animal parks, the ecosystem that they formerly inhabited have largely disappeared. So concluding our today's chapter, we can say that biodiversity can have different organisms that live in terms of biomes and terms of habitat types, and also of the world species. Many of the species, they are threatened or endangered or at the risk of uh, endangering. Biodiversity is important to us because it aids in ecosystem stability, but many factors threaten this biodiversity today. HIPPO, it describes these threats be understood in terms of the environmental conditions. That was all about today's chapter. Thank you.